You are listening to a podcast from The Hindu.
Last week was Nobel Week, that time of the year when a cabal in Sweden calls a select set of scientists around the world at ungodly hours and tells them, "You are a millionaire!"
Dun, dun, dun.
With a 124-year history, this is absolutely the kind of stuff that interests us on the Rearview, isn't it, Shobhana?
Absolutely.
Our subject today was an Indian who successfully transmitted 5G waves from one room to another over a century ago, before people even knew what 2G and 3G were.
This is Jagadis Chandra Bose, inventor, extraordinaire, scientist, teacher, philosopher, pioneering science fiction writer.
Revered as he's in India, he never won a Nobel Prize, though many very strongly believe to this day that he rightfully ought to have. I am Jacob Koshy.
And I'm Sobhana Nair, and this is the
Rearview. Here we dive into the history of things, events, discoveries, and inventions. So, Shobna, there are many facets to him that we are going to uncover, in this podcast. What do we know about him? Where did he come from? Who is he? Give us the origin story, so to say.
So, Jacob Bose was born in Singh, now in Bangladesh, on 30th November 1858.
He would have been a controversial guy today, right? He would have been Bangladeshi.
Yeah, he would have to show his papers.
NRC. Okay.
Yeah. His father, Bhagwan Chandra Bose, was a deputy magistrate posted in Singh. Bose's father embraced Brahmo Samaj, which was one of the progressive branches of Hinduism, and
And it kind of encouraged a shift towards adopting certain British or English ideals of new knowledge, of the advances that were being made in the scientific world.
Jagdish's father was an extraordinary person. He was highly educated and he loved science. And what is significant about him is that at that point, if you are, say, an upper middle class person, you aspired your children to join the civil services or the legal profession, and you would start teaching them English right from the beginning because you wanted him to be part of that upper crust
Was
of
he
the
a
society.
wealthy landowner or something who
He
had
was fairly affluent, but he had all these schemes running up in his head, and at some point later in life, as we shall see in our chat,
so he
that
was kind of
loses his money, and
so he was kind of progressive woke for his time.
he absolutely woke with too many entrepreneurial ideas in his head.
Nice.
Something that his son doesn't have,
As
And
we shall see.
as we shall see. Now, instead of sending Jagdish to English medium school, BC Bose had actually set up a vernacular school of his own where children of farmers and fishermen and laborers went. Jagdish went and studied with them because his father insisted that he should be trained in his mother tongue and grow deep roots in the soil of Bengal. And we shall see the importance of all this in his life as we proceed. Now, Bose was born when the British Crown took over, and he died in 1937, just 10 years short of India attaining independence. So it definitely, the colonial or the imperialism impacted and marked his life right from the beginning. Though I would say that his life was had several exceptions for its time. He was educated at the St. Xavier's College, which was a missionary institution.
This was in Calcutta.
This was in Calcutta. And for his higher studies, he enrolled into Hindu College, which we today know as the Presidency College. And Presidency College had a physics laboratory as far back as 1866. Now, that is an exception for that particular time. Another exception that I should probably flag is that won a scholarship to study in Christ College, Cambridge. Now, Christ College was the first college in Cambridge to admit Indians. And here comes my favorite part. At Cambridge, he came directly under the tutelage of great teachers such as Lord Rayleigh, who had got Nobel Prize for discovering argon. And Jacob, argon is my favorite
Of all
element.
things, I thought it was carbon.
No, of course not. It is not carbon. Why would it be carbon, Jacob?
Because you travel from so far every day singly in your car, spewing all those, greenhouse gas emitting fumes.
Yeah, like you come in a bus. Please, Jacob.
Anyway, why argon?
Arrogant because it is actually a state that I inspire to be in, to be non-reactive, to be resistant to bonding with other elements, absolute recluse, an element that has found inner
Maybe
peace.
you've been bitten by Nobel fever, so you like the noble gases, right?
What?
Argon is like one of the noble gases, but I
Yeah.
like neon. It's noble and it's flashy.
So anyways, coming
Yes,
back to Mr.
Cambridge.
Bose. Now, Mr. Bose has come back from Cambridge and he has not one, but two degrees.
Wow.
He gets from Cambridge, he gets a degree in natural sciences, tripos, and a BS, and he clears the BSc examination of London University. Now, when he returns home before trekking down to his house in Calcutta, he goes all the way to Shimla to meet the then Viceroy, Lord Ripon. Now, Lord Ripon comes across as a very lovely fellow, despite the fact that he is obviously English and I'm sure he has a history of repression, but at least in his relationship with Bose, he comes across as a nice person because he is so impressed and taken in by this young man that he shoots off a recommendation letter to Sir Alfred Croft, the director of public instruction. On reaching Calcutta, Bose calls on Croft, who had already received Ripon's letter, and Croft is pissed
Why?
because Lord Ripon wanted Bose to be accommodated in the Imperial Education Service, and Croft just very crustily tells Bose, "I'm usually approached from below, not from above."
So he didn't like the fact that he got a sifarish straight away from the big boss.
Yeah. Mr. Croft was crafty enough to refuse a berth to Bose in the Imperial Education Service, and instead he offered him a place in the Provincial Service. Now, here, Imperial Education Service was reserved entirely for Europeans. So you had to be white skinned to be part of this service. And but Bose was very adamant. One thing about Bose that we will notice as we go into our conversation that he's very stubborn. And so Bose declined the offer, and noticing that Bose's appointment had not been gazetted, Lord Ripon wrote back to Mr. Croft asking, "Hello, what happened? I wrote to you. Why is this young man not part of the Imperial Education Service?" Croft's hand was forced and he had to include Bose. But even then, our dear crafty Croft gave him only a temporary position and one third of the pay what the other
That's
academics.
just so many levels of mean and pettiness, right? Is it just pure thoroughbred racism at work over here?
Absolutely, don't you think so? I mean,
I mean, I'm trying to understand why would Croft be so insistently dead against, especially when Ripon had already, who was another European and his boss's boss, I guess, by many degrees.
but I guess it is because of this very strong prejudice that Indians are just not meant to do science. I mean, they believed at that point that intellectual acuteness in metaphysics and languages,
Yeah.
well, that's all right. But do Indians have aptitude for exact methods of science?
Yes,
That
because it was also the time when science as a field had was kind of becoming distinct from, let's say, the philosophical sciences or the more abstract sciences, of literature or math. I mean, there was this distinction, especially people like Bose, people who come from intellectualism, who come from well educated families. It was believed that these are the kind of people who would be more, who are like more brahminical in their worldview. So they're not the kind of people who like to work with their hands. They are the kind of people who would be best suited to abstract academic kind of jobs.
But Jacob, what would you do if you are tomorrow told that your salary has been cut to one third of what, say, I'm being paid? What
Well,
would you
yeah.
do?
Well, I thought I have a choice, but let's see. You never know. Maybe I'll just go all Gandhian as Bose was later to do. Tell us something about
Yes,
that.
yes. So Bose actually deployed a very Gandhian method of protest. Now, while continuing his duties as a professor at Presidency College, he resolved never to touch the paychecks.
Wow.
And he continued to do that for 3 years.
3 years.
He did full work and did not take salary. Can
How
you
did he get
imagine?
by?
I have no clue. Maybe he didn't have EMIs to pay and school fees to pay, I
But I,
guess.
I did I did read somewhere that it was around this time that he married Abala Bose. His
Bala Bose and the couple's finances were in
were extremely poor. I read
completely
somewhere they lived in near poverty.
absolute penury, and still he decided to go on, carry on with the protest.
So it's like what you were saying. He's one stubborn cookie.
Absolutely. And that actually melted Mr. Croft because
Wow.
at the end of 3 years, he realized that this man is not, he is continuing with his duties and he's not holding back on his work. And yet he's not touching any of he's not checking, he's not using those paychecks. And he had to give up.
So
And
Krusty Croft finally crumbled.
absolutely, the cookie crumbled and he finally got arrears for all the 3 years of. 3 years
Wow.
that he
Did he
had
go
not
and buy himself a car?
no, that is the thing about Mr. Bose. Mr. Bose would rather buy equipment to carry on with research. And that brings me to the next point. Research came very low in priority in the universities. At the end of 26 hours of weekly lectures and other administrative duties, little time was left for research, and there was no grant available for it. So Bose actually used his own slender income to construct apparatus and pay whatever assistance that he needed. And I doubt very much, Jacob, that in 100 years now, things have changed drastically in the universities, have
Well,
they?
things have dramatically changed, but have also remained the same. I mean, we have for a long time, Indian science is characterized by this attitude of jugaad. Perform specific kind of experiments requires very specific kind of instruments, and they are very very expensive. So many times scientists think of ingenious ways of fashioning their own instruments to get those results. Now things have of course changed a lot from that time, but this is an attitude that kind of remained. But what is very interesting is, to go back to what we were discussing earlier. I mean, Croft thought that this was the. I mean, Croft probably speculated that this was the kind of guy who would not be good at experimenting because he's Indian and Indians aren't great. But he's demonstrating something exactly the opposite. I mean, he's doing stuff with his hands, fashioning it out, making new kinds of apparatus. That's absolutely radical for its time.
Yeah, but what was difficult, more difficult for Bose was the absence of colleagues, like minded colleagues. Remember, this is the last decade of the 19th century. India did not exactly have a thriving scientific community. There was no seminar circuit where Bose could have bounced off ideas with other like minded colleagues. And I believe that science, of all the things, actually, you need people that you can discuss and
Very much,
yeah.
especially because you have new ideas in your head. You want to first sound it out with people who work in your department or people who are familiar with your field to say, first of all, to check, has this stuff been done before? Am I the first one to come up with these ideas? And that kind of guides your own motivation. So there is an element of competition in the sense every scientist, because, and again, he's come back from Cambridge, he's aware of how the practical world of scientific publication works. So he wants to see if if his ideas are genuinely new or old hat.
So Jacob, the reason why we are discussing Bose is because he, as you said right in the opening of this episode, that he was a man who nearly a century back sent 5G signals from one room to the other.
Even before that, it's nearly 125 years now. And this was the time when the coolest science on the horizon was electromagnetic waves. I mean, it's like the AI of today, how everybody's all buzzed up about it. Electromagnetic, science, because people knew that there is light, there is electricity, there's magnetism. They all knew these things were different stuff. But it was around this time that, scientists like Maxwell and Faraday, they saw that electricity and magnetism are connected, and that light is also an electromagnetic wave, and there were different principles that were governed around it. So there was Hertz, the famous scientist. Now he was a guy who practically was able to who discovered these electromagnetic waves, transmitting electromagnetic waves. But electromagnetic waves come in a whole range of spectra, of the amplitude of the wave, the waves that we use for sound, the waves that we use for transmission. But the fact that waves can are carriers of information, and that waves can pass through obstructions, it was already seen as this as a very useful device. It was a useful invention. I mean, people, the very fact that if you could pass on information that was not obstructed by barriers, you could use it to communicate across continents, from land to ship and ship to sea. I mean, there are just millions and millions of application, right? So these Hertz waves that were discovered were like this fascinating new thing that had just emerged upon the world of science.
But Hertz dies at the young age of 36 and he's not able to complete his work. And
Yeah, he
therefore,
was like one of those rock stars of who just went away too early. But a lot of people were had started to work on various aspects of these waves, and one of this was our Mr. Jagdish Bose. I mean, he too had was aware of that. This is the exciting thing in the world of science today, and using some very interesting setup, he was able to generate what is called millimeter waves. These are waves whose amplitudes are in the millimeter range. So the frequency of these waves are in the gigahertz ranges, and that's exactly the kind of communication that now we have entered into 5G technology, and people are bidding billions and billions of dollars, to for licensing these kinds of waves. And the clamor of these waves has led to changes in our government, as we all know,
absolutely,
right?
yes,
So this
yes.
was Jagdish Bose, the good guy doing good things with waves, unlike the UPA government before. But this is a different thing.
That's very controversial statement to make because, as we know,
But he did this very, very awesome set of experiments, right?
yes, way back in 1895, he organized a public lecture in Calcutta where he demonstrated the ability of these waves to travel from the lecture room and through an intervening room and a passage to a third room 75 feet distant from the radiator, and thus passing through three solid walls on the way.
This must have been black magic at that time.
Absolutely, I can imagine. Or I'm not sure whether people even registered it. I mean,
It was like at that time the mode of science was, how magicians come on stage. They used to do these things called demonstrations. It was almost like a magic show, and people would say that here's this guy who would say, "Look, this is what I'm going to show you." So demonstrations were like the thing. But anyway,
so now to get this result from his small radiator, Bose had set up an apparatus which was curiously anticipated the lofty antennae of modern wireless telegraphy. A circular metal plate at the top of a 20-foot pole being put in connection with the radiator and a similar one with the receiving apparatus.
that's like the antennas from our childhoods. Do you remember? Have you ever climbed a,
Oh,
a, a
yes.
terrace and
All the time.
moved antennas around to get
All the
Doordarshan
time.
waves?
All the time. But it's just that I don't think we are such 80s kids, Jacob. I don't think anybody else remembers that. But anyhow, uh, he wanted to actually fix one of those poles on the roof of his house and the other on the Presidency College a mile away to carry on with his experiment. But it was around this time that he leaves for the second time to Europe.
Yeah. In fact, the device that he made was called the coherer. Coher.
It's such
So
a tongue twister. No,
yeah,
won't you
in
like?
fact, it's this metal devices that brings in the waves together. So that's how we get the word coherent. Coherent, incoherent. Stuff which is organized together.
But for anyone reading about Bose today, it is infuriating to know that he didn't care to stamp his ownership all over his findings. So, Coherer is a device that he invented.
That's strange because he had shown that it was possible to send these waves and across rooms, across barriers, and that was potentially like a billion-dollar idea.
Absolutely billion-dollar idea, and he should be known as the father of telegraphy and not Marconi, as a parochialist Bengali would argue. I'm arguing on their behalf.
Yeah, I mean, and in to this day, there is a wealth of science histories, there is wealth of literature to suggest that it was J.C. Bose who should rightly have been credited with the invention of the radio. But history remembers Guglielmo Marconi as the person who did that.
So Jacob, on his trip to Europe, I mean, in May 1901, he does hold a public demonstration at the Royal Institution in UK too. And at that point, Alexander Muirhead, who was a businessman, an entrepreneur, who investor, uh,
Yeah,
equivalent of a startup
it was like the
investor,
Peter Thiel of today, I guess.
I guess. And he approached Mr. Bose and he wanted to buy the technology and he wanted to exploit it to commercial ends. But of course, Mr. Bose was disgusted by the offer. And Mr. Bose's one of the close friends of Mr. Bose was Ravindranath Tagore. And at that point, he writes a letter to Ravindranath Tagore, a letter which has been quoted in several of the biographies of Mr. Bose. He writes to Tagore, if only you could witness the country's greed for money. What a dreadful, all consuming disease this is.
Wow. What do you make of that, Shobna? Do you think Bose was a simpleton? Was he just dumb for not patenting something as mind-bogglingly lucrative, despite people from investors and other capitalists clamoring for a patent?
Well, before I answer that question, I want to talk about Marconi because for me, at least looking back in the history, he comes across as this really, really wild fellow. I don't know. That's just my judgment, and I'm sure others think otherwise. Marconi made history when he transmitted the Morse code of S across the Atlantic from Cornwall in England to Newfoundland in Canada on 12th December 1901. So around the same time, if we may say. But clearly, Bose has held a public demonstration much ahead, except Marconi's distance of
Very much.
is
I mean,
longer.
he showed it as a practical communication
Device.
technology.
Marconi then even traveled on a ship called SS Philadelphia in February 1902 from England to America and kept receiving the radio signals that were transmitted by his assistants every day and got the captain of the ship to endorse the signal reception. Marconi was a good engineer, a shrewd businessman, but of course he had limited knowledge of physics. And as we know famously, Tesla had said that Marconi had infringed on 17 patents for
Yeah.
displaying or manufacturing this technology.
And in fact, in America, Marconi isn't actually credited with inventing the radio. It's actually Tesla who's after a kind of court case that he was considered the inventor.
Yeah. But the advantage that Marconi had, other than his very shrewd entrepreneur mind, was that he was highly connected with the Italian aristocracy and the British royalty because he manages to send a message from Roosevelt to King Edward the Seventh in 1901. Now, if you've done that, it has made news across the country, across the world. In fact, it is very difficult for a second person to say, "No, no, I had done it."
He literally made the right connections, right? Shobna, the question now comes back to, was Bose ever bitter, or did he actually feel that Marconi had stolen his idea and profited out of it?
I don't think so, because Bose actually strongly believed that science should not be driven by temptation of gain, and science should be done for the sake of mankind.
In fact, later on in life, I've read that he told somebody it's the invention that matters, not the inventor.
Sister Nivedita, who is an important
Gandhi's
figure
associate.
in the Indian history, she and an American friend of Bose, Mrs. Bull, who actually paid for and forced him to file his first patent
In the US.
in the US. And our dear Bose would not use his rights, and he actually allowed the patent to lapse. But what Bose lacked in enterprise, he made it up for in goodwill. A group of eminent scientists came together around this time to press the colonial government to set up a well equipped physical laboratory in Presidency College under Bose. And while this got an in principle nod, but as usual, the bureaucracy dragged its feet, and I don't think it didn't happen. And that is, we'll have to come back to it later when we talk about the Bose Institute,
Yeah,
because
so he was a guy who was interested in the science, in the absolute science of it. Now, this is again a kind of impression that has kind of pervaded through Indian science history, that Bose was like this good guy, who really didn't care for. He was above the material greed associated, with invention, and it didn't matter to him. But as you have said before, and what he talked about, what he told Tagore, especially about the industrialization of England, it was important to also understand that this was a time when, I mean, the nationalism movement that is growing root, but also the nationalism movement was premised in a way that India was set itself as something antithetical to the West. I mean, this was the era of technology. I mean, science is going on. Science is about discovering new things, understanding nature, all those, experiments, etc. But there is parallelly also the whole existence of entrepreneurs, capitalists, industrialists. These are people who are trying to make new goods, who have seen the potential of science to make different technologies which can be, and this would make people rich. I mean, many of these early entrepreneurs are people who were coming up in a new era where they saw the opportunity to become fabulously wealthy. Look at Thomas Alva Edison, companies like Westinghouse, for instance. Now this was something that was linked with
but
industrialization.
I have another funny example here to point that it's not just Bose who's alone in this endeavor. Albert Einstein
Absolutely.
once started a company to sell or manufacture
Refrigerators.
refrigerators,
And it
and
failed.
yeah, spectacularly failed.
And that's precisely because Albert Einstein was a patent clerk. I mean, he worked in the patent office because he did not get a full time, a teaching position or a research position in the university. In the case of Bose, he actively resented it because he's, and probably influenced by Tagore, or probably, I know, it was the spirit of
But
the
just
time,
the
I guess.
Eastern philosophy of
Absolutely.
giving and not.
And not being, there was a distinction between science and knowledge, vidya, on one end, and and goods. It's like still the distinction that we make between Saraswati and Lakshmi, right? I mean, we all revere, different people revere them at different points of time. It was that attitude, and there was a sense of revulsion against making money of things. Maybe it was his intellectual background, and I and it's come through that Bose was never bitter that, oh, Marconi. He actually said that this is for other people
To
to
utilize,
commercialize,
and
to
then
make. And I
yeah.
don't think he was actually being
but
modest or
but
something.
Jacob, there is one episode in Bose's life where he insists that the credit that he deserves should be conferred upon him.
And that's to me the most important and most interesting aspect of what makes JC Bose, his whole research into plants.
For me, JC Bose, for a very, very long time, thanks to the NCRT books, was the scientist who opened the world to the fact that plants
Our life.
are alive. Yeah.
Wow. That was such a radical piece of science for its time.
And he sought to bridge the gap between the living and the non-living. And it is interesting because for me it still blows my mind. He was a physicist, and to get into plant physiology, that was very radical even for its time, I
But in a
believe.
sense, it was kind of logical also because remember, he's studying electromagnetic waves, and as we have said, this was very new phenomenon. People had discovered that there is electromagnetic waves all around, ether as it was called, and so if this thing is all around, and Bose from Indian philosophical traditions had this deep idea that everything is connected. I mean, what really demarcates the difference between non-living things and living things? So is there a common element? Is there something that, or something, a vital kind of force that is probably present in people but absent in non-living things? And that time I mean, as a good scientist, it's like applying your ideas to different kinds of, different avenues.
So we'll go chronologically. आप chronology समझिए, Jacob. He returns to Europe in 1900 on invitation of International Congress of Physics in Paris. And this is when he starts working on a paper called Response of Inorganic and Living Matter. It is interesting because, as you just said, that this is actually the most natural logical step, because he's already working with the waves, and he extended the same logic in this paper, where for the first time in science he compares and parallels the responses to excitation of living tissues with those of inorganic matter. Now, why is Bose so important? Because he was neither a botanist or a zoologist or a physiologist, and that is why he had this fresh outlook. He did something which he was not, because he was not trammeled by the customary propositions of a biologist. Is that's the only reason why he could actually think so radically different
And
from
not
them.
only think, he made the experimental, just like he did for transmitting microwaves. He made a whole set of interesting devices that could measure the most sensitive movements in plants. He invented a device called the crescograph, for instance. So being able to, his basic point was, for instance, take a plant, and when you stimulate it, that is, he applied various kinds of stimulation, like, he would hit it hard, or as you say, he would injure it, or he would caress it. And using these very sensitive instruments that he had invented, he saw different patterns of movement, and he saw that there were specific kinds of movements and, patterns in the waves generated when the plants were caressed, or when, or when they were hit hard. And he tried this across different kinds of vegetables and plants. He was the guy, who would actually be talking to plants, and so it was not just speculation. He actually brought the same experimentus kind
Rigor.
of attitude and rigor. And he published papers, all over all this. Did he go to Calcutta? I'm sorry, did he go to London to
Yes, he
publish that?
did. And the reaction was uh, e- extremely interesting. And as they say, that when you come up with something new, the first reaction would be, it is not true. And the next reaction will be, it is not new. And then much later, if the community does not want to accept it or does not want to give you credit, they will just say, we knew it all before. And Bose had to pass through all the three stages before his experiments with plants was
In
accepted.
fact, the very fact that plants transmit information within themselves using electromagnetic waves was by itself not controversial, because there were already scientists, who were working on this. There was August Waller, who was already, they had actually claimed priority over Bose. So again, this is the, another kind of the Marconi issue, but now in a different field. And he claimed priority over Bose for the discovery of what was called vegetable electricity. And this time Bose was not the, yeah,
Adamant.
he was
He
not the
was,
Gandhian,
yes.
and he and what I've read is that this contributed to a long-standing enmity between both of them. And in general, it was well acknowledged that Bose had laid the stronger claim to priority, and by the British scientific establishment itself in many ways.
So Bose read his paper at the Royal Society on June 6, 1901, with full and detailed experimental demonstration. Bose's finding drew attack from Sir John Burden Sanderson, who was then and for many years had been the grand old man of physiological science in England. He began with a compliment on Bose's previous physical work, but then said it was a great pity that he should leave his own sphere of study, in which he had attained such acknowledged distinction, for other fields which properly belong to the physiologist. Basically, stay in your lane, man. That is what Sanderson was telling Bose.
Yeah. The real controversy was also attitudes towards science. There were two ways of looking at it. One is like, the vitalist method, as they call it, that there is a animating force in living beings, whereas inspired by the industrialization of that time, electromagnetic waves, people thought that even living beings were essentially just machines. I mean, you just had to work out, break parts into the smallest constituents, and if you could just bring them all together, that is what the living being was. So people like August Waller, they were, you know when they were analyzing electrochemical responses in plants, they were theorizing that this is something that is very specific to plants. It is kind of similar to what happens in human beings and in the higher animals and mammals, but it was no less connect, but it had nothing to do with the non-living world. Bose's was a different way. I mean, for him, metals, non-metals, everything was kind of connected, and there was a continuum. It's kind of from Darwin's theory of evolution, that there's a single organism that over time, and through the process of evolution, it's what relates all of the living world. He kind of just took this argument into the non-living world too, and that, in full fairness, was kind of controversial for its time.
Yeah, so you know what was Sanderson's next response to his paper? He said the electric response of ordinary plants that Bose describes is absolutely impossible. And because Sanderson said, I have tried to detect this for many, many years, I didn't find it. So how could you? So Bose was then called on to reply. The critics who had supported Sanderson could not fault the findings of Bose's experiment, but instead they wanted him to make modifications which altered the purpose and the meaning of the paper, and to selectively withdraw the facts. It seemed to him inexplicable that the doctrine could be advocated, and in the Royal Society of all the places, that knowledge should advance so far and no further. Bose said that he is open to amend his paper only if his findings are contested on a scientific basis. Bose had actually unwittingly stepped into the caste system of.
Yeah, the scientific establishment of that time, right?
Absolutely. And
And
he was treated as this unwanted intruder.
yeah, but by this time Bose had also matured, and he was I mean, he continued with his experiment. But again, he was this guy he was not he wanted credit, but he was not never credit hungry. I mean, in a fair sense, even work like this, technically could have qualified for, would have been worthy of a Nobel Prize. In fact, it's only in the present era that we have so much more. People rightly credit J.C. Bose as the father of plant neurobiology. So people don't really accept the fact that plants have a similar well-developed nervous system, but so many experiments over time, people who, especially among ecologists who have studied forest ecosystems, they have said and they have proved that plants are able to do the equivalent of anticipating the future, via perceptions of environmental cues. They possess memory. That's why, I mean, okay, just to cycle back a bit, many of these early experiments in plant stimulus were from observations of plants like the Venus flytrap, which is which is able to detect flies and engulf them. So
I think
it's
Sanderson's experiment
was
was
on the
with the
Venus
Venus.
flytrap. So the fact that they have stimuli and respond in particular ways, just like nerves do, was not controversial.
Because you
But
can see that
you can
happening.
see that happening. But the whole thing of electromagnetic waves and they having, I mean, ideas like, for example, is there a plant brain? Is the, for example, the root system of a plant like the spinal cord system that mammals have? These ideas now are not as far out as
It
people
was
think they're.
back then.
Yes.
So, do you know the reason why, the motivation why Bose actually uh, refused to give in? Was because this news went back to India, and in the form of very crude and exaggerated headlines. Bose's work and paper are rejected by the Royal Society, because Royal Society at that point, every paper that was presented to it, it had to give a stamp of approval, and it was published. And the papers that were not published were then sent to the archive, which essentially means that, okay, so far we don't have evidence to accept your findings, but we're keeping it in the back room and we can pull it back at whenever we want. Bose was so uh, depressed by these headlines and by Royal Society's behavior, that he actually sought from the Secretary of State an extension for his foreign deputation. And when there was reply wasn't forthcoming, Bose said that I'm ready to quit if need be, but I have to defend myself and my name and take and secure the credit for this
Ever the
discovery.
adamant guy, right?
Absolutely. But then came the next blow. As I had said, that Bose will pass through all the three stages. Uh, there was evidence that these results are not new and they were known before. I believe it was your friend, Mr. Augustus
Voila.
Waller, who came out with substantially similar results as obtained by Bose, and he claimed the first credit to this discovery. But eventually, and it is a very long process and we'll not go into the details, but eventually the Royal Society accepts Bose's paper, and Bose's ownership is established.
Shobna, so here's this long, meandering, very interesting life of Bose. So, in sum, what do you think is the legacy of Bose? I mean, let's circle back to our original question. Should Bose have Was Bose wrongly denied his Nobel Prize?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I think all his ideas were so revolutionary, and these were not ideas. He had backed up with concrete evidence to each of them. And look at the spectrum of his work.
Absolutely very inventive. But the real legacy of both, I mean, from the way I see it, there are multiple things. Number one, he's considered one of the pioneers of science fiction writing in India.
No, I didn't know that.
So in 1896, Bose wrote Nirudesher Kahini, the story of the
Okay,
Kahini, the story of the missing one.
you have
That's terrible. The Banglas
butchered
are going
the
to be after
Bangla.
me. But that's what it says anyway. So this was a short story, and it was and then it was uh, there was another book, that story that he wrote called, forgive me again, Palatak Tufan, or the runaway sea storm.
फिर से repeat that please.
Come on, I know you're just pulling my leg now over here. Anyway,
Carry on,
so the
Jacob.
point is that he had wide ranging interests and his legacy. I mean, some of the students were SN Bose. I mean, no relation of his, but this is SN Satyendranath Bose was kind of opposite to him. He was a theoretical physicist. And he was the guy I mean, he translated Einstein's relativity papers in from German to English. He explained how particles called bosons, which are different, fundamental particles were different from photons, how they worked. I mean, the math behind it. And Einstein actually translated this paper from English into German, and that's why he was very well. He was one of the most famous scientists in the world. We have the Bose Einstein condensate, is named after S.N. Bose. Then one of his other students was P.C. Mahalanobis, Meghnad Saha. These were all the pioneers of Indian science and the scientific establishment once India actually got its independence. And one very admirable thing about Bose is that he ultimately did all his work primarily in India within an Indian ethos and tradition. Sure, there have been Nobel laureates, Indian Nobel laureate. There was C.V. Raman, who was kind of a contemporary of his, and who also actually took a lot of the methods of Bose in terms of inspiration and doing interesting experiments with limited means. But there have been many scientists, who have won Nobel prizes, but they actually left India,
Long, long
long
back.
back, and they won their awards as American citizens.
I think Bose's biggest contribution to India, apart from, of course, his findings in pure sciences, will always be the Bose Institute. And do you know, Jacob? They actually, the couple, Bose and his wife Abla Bose, used all their life savings to invest in that institute, which still stands
It
as
is.
a
It still is like a remarkable place, and it does some pioneering work. Continues to do pioneering work in the pure sciences. So from microwaves to plants and the question of the Nobel prizes, we didn't give an answer to the original question. Yeah, I think Bose would actually have got a Nobel Prize, if he was somebody from today, because nowadays the pattern of the Nobel prizes in the sciences is that you also find out, you credit both the people who pioneered the original ideas, and as well as people who developed the science enough to create it into bankable technology. Even the prizes from this week for Jeff Hinton or Demis Hassabis, who both are pioneers in AI and its application, neural networks into various different fields. So I think Bose today would have been recognized with a prize if he was around.
Okay, Jacob, that's your view, but I do want to hear from our audience. I want to ask them, do you think JC Bose would have got a Nobel had he been alive around this time?
So that's all the time that we have, Shobna, for this episode. And we'll be back next time with some more interesting deep dive into some plant, animal, person, object. Wait and
Or a
watch.
beast, Jacob?
Wait and watch. Absolutely.
See you. Bye bye.